taking you live now after that NATO meeting. This is Jens Stoltenberg letting us know what the leaders decided.
I invited NATO's close partners, Finland, Sweden, and the European Union, to our summit because this crisis affects us all. Russia has shattered peace in Europe. The people of Ukraine are fighting for their freedom in the face of Russia's unprovoked invasion. We deplore the tragic loss of life, enormous human suffering and destruction. Our thoughts are with those killed, injured, and displaced. We call on Russia to stop this senseless war. Immediately cease its assaults, withdraw all its forces from Ukraine, and turn back to the path of dialogue and turn away from aggression. The Kremlin's objectives are not limited to Ukraine. Russia has demanded legally binding agreements to announce further NATO enlargement and to remove troops and infrastructure from allies that joined after 1997. We are facing a new normal in European security, where Russia openly contests the European security order and uses force to pursue its objectives. The world will hold Russia and Belarus accountable for their actions. Russia as the aggressor, Belarus as the enabler. President Putin's decision to pursue his aggression against Ukraine is a terrible strategic mistake, for which Russia would pay a severe price for years to come. NATO allies and the European Union have already introduced significant sanctions, and many of our partners around the globe have joined us. We must stand ready to do more, even if it means we have to pay a price, because we are in this for the long haul. At the same time, the Russian people must know that Kremlin's war on Ukraine will not make Russia more secure. It will not make Russia more respected in the world. It will not lead to a better future for your children. In response to Russia's massive military buildup over the past months, we have already strengthened our deterrence and defense. Yesterday, NATO allies activated our defense plans. And as a result, we are deploying elements of the NATO response force on land, at sea, and in the air, to further strengthen our posture and to respond quickly to any contingency. The United States, Canada, and European allies have deployed thousands of more troops to the eastern part of the alliance. We have over 100 jets at high alert, operating in over 30 different locations, and over 120 ships from the high north to the Mediterranean, including 3 strike carrier groups. There must be no space for miscalculation or misunderstanding. We will do what it takes to protect and defend every ally and every inch of NATO territory. Leaders today also made clear that we must continue our support to Ukraine. the Kremlin is trying to make NATO and the EU provide less support to our partners. So our collective answer must be more support to countries like Georgia, Moldova, and Bosnia-Herzegovina, to help them succeed with their democratic reforms and pursue the path that they have freely chosen. More than ever, this crisis demonstrates the importance of North America and Europe standing together in NATO. There is no security in Europe without a strong transatlantic bond. With that, I'm ready to take your questions.
Okay, we'll go to Al Jazeera.
James Bays, Al Jazeera. How fearful are you about the possible fall of Kyiv? How long, in your estimation, can the government of Ukraine last? And if we move to a resistance insurgency type situation, what support can NATO then give?
So what we see now is a full-fledged invasion of Ukraine from multiple directions with air, sea, and land capabilities. And this is actually in line with what our intelligence services predicted over a long period of time, because we saw the build-up around Ukraine with air, sea, and land forces. We see, of course, that they're moving towards Kiev. We also see the rhetoric, the messages, which is strongly indicating that the aim is to change government, to change and remove the democratically elected government in Kiev. We are in close contact with the government of Ukraine. We are, of course, monitoring the situation very closely. It is still a fluid situation. What we have seen is that the Ukrainian forces are fighting bravely and are actually able to inflict damage on the invading Russian forces. But again, it is a very fluid and an evolving situation. NATO allies expressed at the summit today that they provide support to Ukraine. They are ready to continue to provide support to Ukraine, military support, financial support, humanitarian support. And then I think we all have to judge how things evolve. But the message from NATO leaders and also from Finland and Sweden, EU, is that we are there to support Ukraine. We have supported Ukraine for many years, and we continue to provide support.
We'll go to the National Press Agency of Ukraine.
Dmitry Shkurko, National News Agency of Ukraine. Secretary General, in the current situation which we observe now in Ukraine, does NATO preserve its desire to assist Ukraine with defensive equipment? In particular, can we expect that NATO will provide Ukraine with so badly needed anti-aircraft equipment? Thank you so much.
So NATO allies continue to provide support to Ukraine, and it was actually at the meeting today at the NATO summit with EU and Finland and Sweden, allies announced and also informed other allies about the type of weapons, the type of support, and some of that also includes air defense systems. So NATO allies have and continue to provide support, military, but also different types of equipment to Ukraine. Then we all realize that, of course, in this very evolving and difficult situation, it's hard to predict what will be the what are the possibilities in the future. But allies are providing support and are very committed to continue to provide support.
Okay, we'll go to NBC, just behind the cameras.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. There's concern that NATO could get pulled into this conflict if Russia were to shut down electricity or other services in Ukraine that could spill over into Poland or Romania. Can you say explicitly whether a Russian cyber attack of that nature would trigger an Article 5 collective defense?
So we are sending a very clear message to Russia that we provide support to our partner, Ukraine, and allies provide many different types of support. NATO help Ukraine also with their cyber defenses. But then for NATO allies, we provide the absolute security guarantees under the Washington Treaty, Article 5. An attack on one will be regarded as an attack on all. And we are clear on this distinction because it is important to make sure that we don't have an even bigger crisis in Europe where Russia challenge or is threatening or attacking any NATO allied country. And that's the reason why we so clearly send a message that we are there to protect all allies and every inch of NATO territory. When it comes to cyber attacks and the risk for incidents and accidents, for instance, in the Black Sea, we are pursuing mechanisms of deconfliction to prevent that from happening. We have, as NATO allies, especially the United States, have done that, for instance, in Syria over a long period of time. And we, of course, are very focused. I spoke with Sarkar, the NATO Supreme Commander, on that issue recently. And he is very focused on the need to deconflict to make sure that we don't have incidents or accidents that can spiral and get out of control and create a very dangerous situation. On cyber, well, we have stated that cyber attacks can trigger Article 5, but we have never gone into the position where we give a potential adversary the privilege of defining exactly when we trigger Article 5. We are focused on strengthening our cyber defenses. We are very much aware of that that's a risk, and therefore we are stepping up both the protection of our cyber networks, but also providing support to Ukraine, and we are very focused on the need for deconfliction.
Okay, we'll go to NPR Deutsche Welle.
Thank you. Terry Schultz with NPR and DW. I want to know more about the deployment of the NRF forces, please. How many will be sent where, from where? How long will it take to get there? Thinking about military mobility as always. And also, what has changed in your calculation about the threat to NATO territory that has led allies to make the decision to deploy this for the first time in history for the purposes of collective defense? Thank you.
Well, what has changed over the last days is, of course, that there's a full-fledged invasion of a partner, a country that borders several NATO allied countries. And this is the most serious security crisis we have faced in Europe for decades. And therefore, we have the High Readiness Force, we have the NATO Response Force, and that's the reason why we are deploying it to, again, prevent any miscalculation, any misunderstanding that we are not ready to protect and defend all allies. And of course, this is something all allies have agreed to do, 30 allies agreed. But of course, especially those in the eastern part of the alliance are extremely concerned. They are close to this, the fighting in Ukraine, and they also border Russia, and they have seen not only the military buildup and the ongoing war in Ukraine, but also seen the very threatening rhetoric. Because this goes far beyond Ukraine. This is about how Russia is actually challenging, contesting core values for our security and demanding that NATO should withdraw all forces and infrastructure from almost half of our members. And they have stated that if we don't do that, if we don't meet their demands, there will be what they call military technical consequences. So we have to take this seriously. And that's exactly why we are now deploying the NATO Response Force for the first time in a collective defense context. And we speak about thousands of troops. We speak about air and maritime capabilities. They are already actually part of the standing naval groups. We have many planes operating in the eastern part of the alliance, and then several allies have partly already assigned troops and forces to the NATO Response Force. We have the lead elements, which are led by France. We have the United States, which has assigned thousands of troops to the NATO response force, and these will be deployed to different places in the eastern part of the alliance. Well, they are partly coming from the United States, but these are also very much European troops. For instance, the lead element, the VJTF, the High Readiness Joint Task Force, is now led by France. There's a strong German component there, and other allies also part of that.
Associated Press.
Lorne Cook, Associated Press. Just to follow up on that, Secretary General, the VJTF can only go to one place, and you have 8 allies that are extremely nervous. I mean, where might you send it? Have you identified a particular weakness on that eastern flank? Thank you.
But I think we have to understand that we have many elements, components of the NATO response force. We have increased the readiness of the NATO response force, and then I don't speak only about the lead element or the VJTF, the Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, but we speak about more elements than just that one. Second, we have allies, the United States, but also United Kingdom and other allies that have increased readiness of forces that are assigned to NATO and the NATO response force. So, of course, these are additional forces that we can deploy as part of the broader deployment of the NATO response force. I'm not saying that we are deploying the whole force. The size of the NATO response force has been tripled since 2014 to roughly 40,000 troops. I'm not saying we're deploying the whole thing. I'm saying that we are deploying elements of the lead, also the VJTF, and elements of the rest of the NATO response force. And then it is for SACEUR to make final decisions exactly on where the different elements are deployed. But we activated the defense plans yesterday, and now the elements of this force will be deployed, or is being deployed.
Okay, we'll go to TV2. Lady in white. Lady in white over there.
Thanks, Elin Sørsdal, TV2 Norway. I'll just follow up on AP and what Terry from NPR said. How quick can these troops and this force be deployed?
But some of these forces are already operating because we have sea and air forces, which are also already part of the NATO maritime forces operating from the Barents Sea down to the Mediterranean. Some are air forces, the air component of the NATO response force. And then some of the land forces are also can move within a few days because they are part of either the lead element, which has already high readiness, or the other elements that has been put on high readiness. So we speak about days, and some are already operating because we have increased our presence already.
Okay, we'll try to take a couple of questions online. We'll go first to Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung, Thomas Kutschka.
Thanks a lot. Good afternoon. Secretary General, in the statement that has just been released, it is said that Russia's actions are flagrant rejection of the principles enshrined in the NATO-Russia Founding Act. And then it continues, it is Russia that has walked away from its commitments under the Act. Does that mean that NATO now considers the NATO-Russia Founding Act as obsolete, or do NATO member states are they still bound? Do they still feel bound by this document? Thanks a lot.
The NATO leaders decided today a statement where they clearly state the fact that Russia has walked away. The NATO-Russia Founding Act is based on some core principles enshrined in the Founding Act, and that is the respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty of all countries, including, of course, Ukraine. And this has been violated not once but twice, and has actually been constantly violated since 2014 with the illegal annexation of Crimea and the continued presence of Russian forces and Russian-backed separatists in eastern Ukrainian Donbass. And this is further violated with the full-fledged invasion of Ukraine that we have seen over the last couple of days. So what we see is that Russia show no respect for the NATO-Russia Founding Act. And of course, if you have a founding act between two partners, NATO and Russia, and one part doesn't respect that agreement, the agreement doesn't work. It doesn't function. It doesn't help us to improve our relationship with Russia. Because even if the founding act has good provisions and good intentions, if these intentions and the provisions and the founding act is not respected, it doesn't work. So that's the reality. The NATO-Russia Founding Act doesn't work because one side, Russia, has violated it over many years, but now we see a extremely blatant and flagrant violation of the Founding Act with the invasion of Ukraine.
We'll take the next question online also from Greg Palkett from Fox.
Thank you, Juana. Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. Two quick questions, one about war, one about peace. Do you agree with some reports of intelligence officials that Kiev could fall within the next, say, day or two? And despite the bravery of the fighting that you have cited among Ukrainian soldiers, do you see a defeat inevitable if war goes on? And the quick question about peace, there is discussion of President Zelensky offering to discuss with Russia an approach to peace that might include neutrality for Ukraine. Would you agree to something like that? Thank you.
The first on the situation on the ground. It is a full invasion of Ukraine. They are moving towards Kiev, and the stated goal is to change the government of Ukraine. It is a very unpredictable situation. Therefore, I will not speculate, but I will pay my respect to the Ukrainian armed forces, which are really proving their bravery and their courage by fighting and standing up against the much larger invading Russian force. On potential talks between the government of Ukraine, President Zelensky, and Russia, my main message is that this is for President Zelensky and the government of Ukraine to decide. What we need to see now is that Russia stop the attack against Ukraine, that they withdraw their forces and cease all the attacks on Ukraine. That's the easiest, the fastest, and the best way to peace. So if they want peace, then it's just stop to attack Ukraine. And therefore we call on Russia to do exactly that.
Okay, we'll go to NTV.
Yes, Sonomot from NTV. Secretary General, two short questions. First, you're a statistician, and so far with regard to risk, you have already evaluated the risk and the threat against NATO coming from Russia. Particularly, you foresee the playbook of Russia. And so my first question is, what is the risk that this conflict spread where, and what might be the end goal of Russia? And my second question is, you have at the tip of your fingers the security of 1 billion citizens in the transatlantic area. So you met with on BTC all the leaders. Can you reassure the public opinion that if there is a genuine threat coming from, because the rhetoric, the aggressive rhetoric of Russia, its behavior is unacceptable, that all member states are committed to defend and protect every single centimeter of NATO? Thank you.
In the meeting today with NATO leaders, it was a very strong message of unity, a very strong message of resolve that we need to stand together, not only in words, but also in deeds. So we agreed a strong statement calling on Russia to stop the attacks on Ukraine, to withdraw its forces, but also we agreed to continue to provide support to Ukraine and also continue to strengthen our presence in the eastern part of the alliance to prevent any attack on any NATO allied country. We have a defensive presence in the east. We are increasing our presence, not to provoke a conflict, but to prevent the conflict. And as long as there is no doubt about NATO's readiness to protect and defend all allies, and our commitment to the core message, the core task of NATO, one for all for one, an attack on one ally will be regarded as an attack on all, then no ally will be attacked. And that will prevent the conflict. And that will preserve peace for NATO allies and for 1 billion people. And that's the reason why we communicate so clearly, and that's the reason why we are deploying more troops in the eastern part of the alliance, to make sure that there is no possibility to misunderstand our readiness to protect and defend all allies. And again, this is to preserve peace, to prevent an attack, and to prevent that the war which is going on in Ukraine spill over to any NATO allied country. And that was the message from NATO leaders today. That was also the message when I met with many of them in the G7 yesterday. And that is also, of course, a message when we speak to close partners, Finland, Sweden, and the European Union, because we all are concerned, and Russia's attack on Ukraine is more than an attack on Ukraine. It's a devastating, horrendous attack on innocent people in Ukraine, but it's also an attack on the whole European security order. And that's the reason why we take it so extremely seriously.
Deutsche Welle.
Thank you, Alexandra von Nahm, Deutsche Welle. Secretary General, one question on Ukraine's request for Turkey to close the Bosporus for Russian warships. Was that discussed today? And one follow-up on the question just asked. We heard today from the Lithuanian foreign minister saying that when we lose Ukraine today, we will be fighting for NATO later. Would you say that the statement is exaggerated? Thank you.
So on the Bosporus, that was not an issue. The potential attack or any potential attack on a NATO allied country, well, that has been my message throughout the whole day. That was the message from the NATO leaders in the summit today, is that we are there to protect and defend all allies. NATO is the strongest military alliance in the world. And make no mistake, we are there to protect and defend all allies and every inch of NATO territory. And we convey that message again and again, both in words but also in deeds. And that's the way to prevent war, that's the way to prevent an attack, to preserve peace, and we have done so for more than 70 years, and we will continue to do it also in the light of the attack on Ukraine.
Thank you very much. This concludes this press conference.
So that was Antony Blinken, Biden Secretary of State, and the Ukrainian Foreign Minister together there at the State Department, talking about sanctions. The Ukrainian Foreign Minister thanked the Americans profusely for our full diplomatic, economic, and military support of their country, and kind of hinted that there isn't full unity within Europe. The Foreign Minister said, it's one thing to condemn, but action has to follow a condemnation. So there is some splits that are occurring between the European powers. Pete Hegseth, your reaction to what we saw there at the State Department and what you heard from President Biden this afternoon?
Yeah, a lot of words, a lot of talk about agreements, sanctions. What I saw in that briefing room was impotence and resignation. Two people resigned to whatever Vladimir Putin is deciding to do. And Antony Blinken talked about laying out the playbook. What have we done? We've laid out the playbook at every step of what Vladimir Putin has done, except it doesn't feel like we've done it either as a ref or a coach or even a player, more like an observer outside of what's happening there. Totally resigned because the leverage we once had, which is ultimately energy, and you know, Russia supplies 10% of the world's oil, a third of Europe's oil, 60% of Germany's oil. Back to Ronald Reagan, we were trying to stop pipelines from the USSR to Europe. We didn't stop it. Donald Trump wanted to stop it. So they did have that leverage. They do have those opportunities. And so we're just an observer at this point. And we were talking, Dana, as we were watching, where's the pound the table moment of we will not allow this to happen? This is a challenge between what Vladimir Putin wants to do and Xi Jinping in China, a new alliance that they have, a world that they want to replace. And they want to undo what was a naive Western foreign policy consensus for quite some time, that if you liberalize and you open up to China or to Russia and allow them to provide your energy, democracy and freedom and other benefits will flow from that. Instead, autocrats like Xi Jinping in China and Vladimir Putin in Russia have enriched themselves in the hope of making Russia great again. And we're kind of on the sidelines saying, we'll do what we can, we'll ratchet up the sanctions. Do you think Vladimir Putin is concerned at this moment about a single sheet of paper or a single sanction that we've talked about so far? And that's why it all felt very impotent.
And the American people are concerned about the price of gas. The president mentioned that. He said, you know, there's going to be costs jammed up onto Russia, but those costs are also going to hit the American driver. Dana, listen to this.
Defending freedom will have cost for us as well, and here at home. We need to be honest about that. But as we do this, I'm going to take robust action to make sure the pain of our sanctions is targeted at the Russian economy, not ours.
Well, I don't believe that at all. But do you think he explained why we're going to be paying these costs?
Well, a couple of things on this. I think the energy is the biggest story out of this, and it's just the backbone of every economy. And for so many years, we've been talking mostly about climate change and figuring out a way to get to electric vehicles. Great goal, but you can't change the law of physics, and fossil fuels are so important to economies. And now we're seeing that play out. Russia is actually probably over-dependent on oil and gas for its economy, but we are underdependent, and Europe is a disaster. And they've been told since the Reagan administration, don't make yourselves dependent. Now,
what did John McCain call Russia? A gas station with nukes?
Yeah, but President Biden today is talking about that gas prices could go up. But let's be clear, they were already up. Okay, so we've had supply chain issues, but also there were policy decisions made by President Biden on his first day in office, amongst other things, where they're canceling oil and gas leases that make us more vulnerable to these kinds of things. And so energy is the most important thing. This is the price that countries pay when they give up energy independence. And we're seeing that play out on the world stage. A couple of things that Blinken said that might be not a pound the table moment, but the last thing he said was, if Putin decides to escalate, so will we. Okay, but then what does that mean? Because if Putin doesn't care about sanctions, then what is the next step? Will we provide aid to any sort of insurgency? I will also point out that the foreign minister of Ukraine made it clear that the minor incursion point that President Biden made at his press conference a couple of months ago was not helpful in any way, because that has also made Europe a little bit less stable. Last thing is something, it's just an instinct. I'm not saying I know President Putin. I had a chance to be in the room with him several times. He looks different to me. Like this, it feels like something has changed even with the pandemic. I don't know exactly what it is, but I was just reminded that President Macron of France, when he met with him, he said something in Putin has changed. Like something, like maybe something up here, maybe something in his gut instinct, but that is kind of what we're dealing with, is a change in his strategic direction.
And President Biden has said that he is going to whip Putin's butt. Martha, he's been saying it for years. He's got his number, that Putin respects him. Here's just number 3, a flashback saying, you know, there was no way Biden was ever going to back down to the guy. Listen.
Putin knows if I am president of the United States, his days of tyranny and trying to intimidate the United States and those in Eastern Europe are over. I'm going to stand up to him.
Okay. Has he stood up to him?
Yeah, well, we'll see how that works out. It doesn't seem like Vladimir Putin is too concerned about that comment. And I just want to touch on what Dana was just saying, because this earlier, General Kellogg was talking about this. He said, this is not the man, meaning Putin, who I had several interactions with during the Trump administration. Something has changed in him. And when you watch, I thought a really interesting exchange between Putin and his spy chief, when the spy chief stood up basically and said, you know, yes, I support what we're doing. And he was very flustered. And Putin said, what do you mean you support what we're doing? He said, I support, you know, the entry of Luhansk and Donetsk into the Russian Federation. And he said, that's not what we're doing. they're independent. We're declaring their independence. Like you're on the wrong page. And it just reminds me of the kind of scene that we've seen with prior dictators.
Like a mobster.
When they start, yes, when they start to kind of lose it a little bit. And he's got all these anniversaries, the 100th anniversary tomorrow of the founding of the Soviet Union. He has said that was the saddest day of Russian history. And he wants to put this empire back together. He's, 73 years old. How many more years does he have to really do this? And he senses that this is his moment. So there's a danger in the air with Putin. And that is a very difficult thing to solve with, Minsk and Normandy agreements and papers, because I think he hears that and goes, whatever, throw your papers up in the air. This is what I'm doing.
Yeah, I mean, we can only do so much if this guy wants to do what he wants to do and he's got the backing of the Russian military the way he has it. Let's listen to a little bit of the president earlier, Harold Ford Jr., and we just kind of get a sense of his tone.
This is the beginning of a Russian invasion of Ukraine. Who in the Lord's name does Putin think gives him the right to declare new so-called countries on territory that belong to his neighbors? We still believe that Russia is poised to go much further in launching a massive military attack against Ukraine. Hope I'm wrong about that. Hope we're wrong about that. But Russia has only escalated its threat against the rest of Ukrainian territory. Russia's moved supplies of blood and medical equipment into position on their border. You don't need blood unless you plan on starting a war.
So that's a major piece of intelligence that the United States has, to see that they're moving blood. I can't see why he would do that if he wasn't going in hard.
So I don't differ with a lot around the table, but I have a slightly different perspective on it. I think the main point that's been made here that should be noted is the point that you just made, Martha, that Dana made first. Something's not right about Putin here. And if indeed you want to draw the mobster, gangster analogy, normally when the head of a family demonstrates a lack of capacity like that, he or she's taken out. And in our world, it's men that are taken out. So perhaps there's some internal, which I think all of our comments have speculated and implicated that maybe there's not the agreement amongst all of his deputies that he wants. Number two, there's been no nation that has come forward to demonstrate any support for what Putin is doing. There's no question. He thought the way he's handled this and the way he's projected he would handle this would cause some division within NATO. You can listen to any commentator, any general. They all said they've not seen NATO this united. There's no doubt. Listening to him the other day rewrite, revise, and reimagine the end of the Cold War was one of the strangest and most fascinating history lessons that one could ever fictionalize about. And he had even his own, the group that is supposed to be his greatest supporters, there was inertia in that room. So I'm encouraged a little bit by that. It was also interesting to see the Ukrainian foreign minister. He doesn't look like a lackey for the United States. He seems credible. He seems honest. He is relentlessly patriotic about being a Ukrainian and made clear to your points earlier, Jesse, to Secretary Blinken, look, we're with you guys. We hope you act. All of the histrionics are great, but let's act. I think it's important that Blinken and the Ukrainian foreign minister continue to do these kind of press conferences. I think it sends a message to Russia, to the world, to Americans alike, who I don't think we're prepared to send troops there. And I also think the audience that's also looking at this is China. China has not said a word about this. In fact, they've said that they respect sovereign boundaries. We'll see where that goes. But to see NATO fortified, strong like this, and to see us standing with Ukraine and the foreign minister there in D.C.
Yeah.
No, but Jesse, there's not been anything. We can say verbal, and we could be critical, and I'm fine with that. But he is unflinching in his support of what we're doing. The Ukrainian foreign minister is, and I think Blinken and the president have made clear we're unflinching in our support of them. I think that's a positive right now.
So what happens if this thing moves into not just Ukraine? What if Vlad goes into Poland? What if he goes into some of the Baltic NATO states? You think Joe Biden's going to trigger Article 5 and send a massive amount of American soldiers into Eastern Europe to defend Estonia? Do you think that could happen?
I actually think he would.
You think he will?
I think attack on one is attack on all, and I think NATO, if there's one thing that's bulletproof about NATO, it's that belief. But I disagree slightly with what Harold said, because and you mentioned it, talk is one thing. You can talk all you want about being united. But when you look at NATO and those NATO countries, you can't gut your military to pay for your welfare state and open up your borders and then believe you can muster the kind of collective will necessary to stare down a maniac who has ambitions potentially on that continent. What is the 82nd Airborne doing right now in Poland as they prepare? they're setting up processing centers for refugees.
Oh boy.
That's what our soldiers and Border Patrol agents do best these days with invasions. They help facilitate refugees. I don't think that Vladimir Putin believes his adversaries are fundamentally serious right now. He doesn't believe the West is a serious civilization. We're running around talking about genders and reparations and all of this. He sees us divided. He sees us as self-loathing. And as a result, he thinks this is his moment to make an aggressive move, because we may talk about Article 5, and we should, but would the American people truly support sending our boys halfway across the world to fight against Vladimir Putin? I think the elites would want us to do so. The population in America would probably see.
Do you think those oligarchs who have some of that financing coming their way, some of what we're doing, you think they're going to call him? I think they are. Look, we can't have it every which way. And I know that we don't like, some around the table don't like Biden, don't like Democrats, and that's fine. But one thing is clear. He does not have the support, I think, Putin, of everyone he wants in Russia on this. He does not have the oligarch. And at the end of the day, I agree with you in this regard. We're not going to take him out with our military. It's going to be an internal thing that weakens him. And I think he's weakened by that. Those troops on those guns, you served. Can you imagine being in one of those bunkers right now, one of those 190,000 troops in that cold, waiting for them to tell you you're going to go and perhaps kill Russians in Ukraine? I think this is a far more nuanced and complicated thing. And I understand our politics here, but I got to tell you, I'm rooting for the president. I know we all are, but I'm rooting for him in a big way. And I'm rooting for Blinken as well in these conversations and showdowns.
All right. Dana, would you like to say anything before we go to break?
Wrap it up. The other piece of news was that the foreign minister of Russia, Lavrov, was supposed to have a meeting with Blinken on Thursday. That is off because Blinken said he would only meet if there was not an invasion. Now, at 8:30 a.m. this morning, it was only an incursion, but the administration at 9:02 a.m. finally said it was an invasion. So that meeting is off.
Okay. I mean, it is interesting how we've kind of moved the language, Martha. At first, as Dana said, it changed. It got more intense. And then so did the sanctions. Last night, we had a certain set of sanctions just on that eastern region. Then we went a higher step. You heard the foreign minister say he expects a lot more sanctions to keep getting piled on and not give Putin a sense of, okay, this is as far as we're going to go.
Yeah, I think the language of minor incursion that the president used a couple of weeks ago was a big mistake, because he lost the ability last night to say that and to allow it to be true, right? So in this essence, last night, once he said that, any invasion had to be called an invasion or he would have looked weak.
Right.
So that got corrected within an hour this morning. That wiggle room was eaten up by dropping that phrase when he did.
Can I ask Martha a question about,
Please.
I'm just thinking about this on my way here, knowing that you would be here today, because you have such a close relationship with many of the World War II veterans, and you had a chance to interview them. And obviously the Cold War was different than World War II, but it was an outgrowth of it. And you read Gerard Baker today in the Wall Street Journal, who said, we won the Cold War, but we then lost it as the West because we didn't focus. And I wonder if you have any insight as to how people are feeling.
Actually, it's funny because I think about, your experience, because it's something that I think a lot of Americans don't think a lot about, and that is the creation of all of those NATO countries after the Cold War, right? After the fall of the Soviet Union, when they were so weak, to then build up that bolster of NATO nations right on their border that really aggravated them, right? So was that the best move at that point? It's almost like post-World War II, how much do you beat up Germany at that point? You want them to become a democracy that can thrive after it's all over. And I think that's something that historically we have to look back at and say, was that a mistake or not, to incorporate all of those NATO nations right on their border, right when they were at their weakest?
Do you think there ever will be any accountability? Obviously expanding NATO year after year right to Russia's doorstep, but also making the Ukrainians give their nukes back in the early 90s. Are we ever going to get any accountability for the world community, as the foreign minister said from Ukraine? We said, yes, we'll give these back, but we expect you to get our back if we ever get invaded, and they've been invaded twice.
Yeah.
And have not, and the world has not supported in the way they believe they would be supported.
Yet another lesson that unilateral disarmament not very effective.
Right.
You're surrounded by people who would like to take your land, and there's a litany of other examples where that's the case. You mentioned Libya, obviously. So when you're staring down the barrel, you talk about a guy in a trench. What are they thinking about? I guess I'd be thinking about, it depends on what trench you're in and what part of Ukraine, because there's a lot of different.
The second biggest country on the
It's a huge country with a huge amount of resources and a lot of leverage because of where the pipelines currently go. I mean, every other pipeline that Russia supplies fuel to Europe goes through Ukraine or Belarus.
Yep.
And Russia effectively controls Belarus at this point. So Nord Stream 1, which operates right now, is operational, bypasses all of that. And so would Nord Stream 2, which we shut off. I would want to hope that the world's leaders, especially the United States, whether we take military action or not, listen, that when an ambitious man says he's going to do something, that we take it seriously. It may sound like the musings of someone who wants to reestablish Russia, but he is 73 years old. What is his mental state? I don't know. But I know he admires Vladimir Lenin. I know he admires the legacy of the Soviet Union and would like to see himself on that same pedestal. And will go as far as he needs to make that happen.
I would maybe mention one thing about NATO, to something that I learned over the years of being there, which is that in history, it shows that democracies usually don't declare war on each other. And there's a desire from people who are born free. Like if we all believe that you are born with the inherent belief that you are free individuals, then you want to have self-determination. So that's why there was all this fight against communism and socialism, because these countries recognize that the path to making sure that their citizens have opportunities and freedom and free will, that was through democracies. And so NATO would provide you that protection. So that's why there was the push. And I think I admire countries that really wanted to join NATO because they wanted to be a part of it. Why did Ukraine want so badly to be a part of it? One, they want their own self-determination. It's a young country now. A lot of the people that live there did not live under Russian rule. Mm-hmm. They don't remember that. They don't want to go back to that necessarily. And that's why you see the attempts to fight. I didn't hear a lot of talk today in all the words that were spoken, the word freedom. I mean, is that what we're talking about here? And to me, that makes a really big difference. Now, it doesn't mean that your fights are fought for you by other people necessarily, but can you be a part of the free world? In my opinion, I think we should fight for that in whatever ways we can. The one thing we have not mentioned, and this is a concern, and I think the Biden administration is doing pretty well on this so far, hopefully, which is Putin's capabilities of wreaking havoc on the world in regards to cyber attacks. So our water supply and that of Ukraine and the Europeans, your energy supply, your food supply, your ability to do banking transactions, your ability to just Google whatever you want, that is on the line here.
Well, that goes to your point about the freedom argument. Has the president looked the American people, Harold Ford Jr., directly in the eye and said, this is what we're doing in Eastern Europe, this is why we're doing it, and this is what could happen because we're doing it? He kind of flirted with it with the gas prices and says, oh, I have a plan. Well, he said he's had a plan before, and he didn't have a plan, or the plan didn't work. So I don't know if we trust that. But you had cyber to that. You saw the market down like 600 points earlier this afternoon. If you have a couple months of a market like that and gas goes to $4 and maybe they hit Colonial last time, we could go a tit for tat with cyber and sanctions. You're coming out of a pandemic where people are just getting their head above water. Mm. I don't know if this country is ready mentally, financially for something like that. Are we ready?
I hope so. Look, you don't get an opportunity during the lead up to war to really prepare as much as you want. I think Don Rumsfeld got criticized for saying you go to a war with the army you have, not the army you want.
But it's also true.
It's true. There's knowns, there's unknowns, and there's unknown unknowns. Right.
So, the administration, to their credit, have tried to warn big companies and small companies alike about how not to defend against a cyber attack, but what's your continuity plan? We should anticipate we're going to have some reaction from this, and they should understand that we will be offensive as well. And I think the president's made clear. I agree with Dane on this NATO thing. I hope, there's a whole history behind this, and we can perhaps the giving up of the weapons of Ukraine is maybe something we should look back at. But in terms of joining NATO, I'm glad all of those nations did. And I think President Reagan had it best when he said there is no security or no safety in the appeasement of evil. And I think this president, our president, is doing everything he possibly can, short of sending troops. And I think Pete has a greater perspective on this than I do, and perhaps most around the table. But this president, I think, is using every tool and playing every card. It was not a great hand, but I think he's playing it as well as he possibly can.
I think that we should mention President Trump and NATO, actually, because even though he was criticized for saying, oh, NATO is weak, kind of poking at NATO, but what he did is he made NATO sit up and take notice. And a lot of those countries did start to pay more of their contributions into NATO. And I understand that the Biden administration wants to say that NATO has never been more united. Again, I don't know that because of the energy issue. But President Trump, I think, deserves a lot of credit for making sure that NATO was one on the radar, but that also that everyone that was in NATO was put on notice that if you want to be a part of this, if it's all for one and one for all, then that means that you have to be fulfilling your commitments. President Trump made that happen.
And he put Germany on notice too. He said, you're getting all your energy from Russia,
Yeah,
and we're
hard to stop
paying to defend you from Russia. That doesn't make a lot of sense. Martha, here's the president today talking about what he's doing in terms of deployments strategically and defensively with some of our NATO allies. Watch.
Today, in response to Russia's admission that it will not withdraw its forces from Belarus, I have authorized additional movements of U.S. forces and equipment already stationed in Europe to strengthen our Baltic allies, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Let me be clear, these are totally defensive moves on our part. We have no intention of fighting Russia. We want to send an unmistakable message, though, that the United States, together with our allies, will defend every inch of NATO territory and abide by the commitments we made to NATO.
So, Martha, when he says that, is he saying that for domestic consumption? Like, I'm not going to drag us into a war. Is he telling Putin, listen, we're not trying to start a war in Eastern Europe? Who is he talking to?
I think that, echoes of Afghanistan are still ringing in his ears. He just pulled out of one war. He doesn't want to look at the American people say, I might be bringing you into another. But there's only one reason to ramp up your presence in the NATO countries. And that's if you think that there's a chance that Putin might actually go into one of them. And so at that point, given everything that we've said here about NATO and Article 5, that's the moment when the president needs to say, make no mistake, we are ironclad on Article 5. Don't even think about an encroachment in any of these countries, right? I mean, that would be the moment when you would, if you are, ascribing to Article 5, then that's when you have to stand up and say.
And I think that's what he said, though. I think
he's trying to speak to Putin, but the only message Putin's going to get is he's going to use it as a rationale to go further. Look, the NATO countries are surrounding me. They're going on the offensive. He'll use it for internal propaganda.
It's true.
But he's clearly saying we're not going boots on the ground in Ukraine, and we're completely defensive. There's going to be no offense in these countries.
I mean, it's amazing to me that an American president says, we are just purely defensive here. I'm like, why is that? I don't understand why we waited on the sanctions. I feel like I understand that you thought it would be a deterrent against it, but he'd already escalated so much, he should have been sanctioned earlier.
Yeah, and that's what the Ukrainian foreign minister said right there, too. All right, we're going to monitor this breaking news out of Ukraine and keep you posted.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wilson-Raybould, for sharing your perspective with the committee. It's much appreciated. So, folks, I'm just going to lay out the rules for the questions. I'm usually a very flexible chair in terms of time, but as we've done for the meetings on this issue, we're going to stick to the time limits. And as a result, I would ask if the witness where somebody's asking for a quick answer it could be a little bit succinct. But I'll obviously want you to be able to finish your answers. So we're going to start. So the first round is 6 minutes conservative, 6 liberal, 6 NDP, 6 liberal, and I'll let everybody know in advance of every round what the time limits are. We'll start with Ms. Wright.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wilson-Raybould. I appreciate your patience on getting here today. It hasn't been an easy path, but I know that Canadians really appreciate it, and they appreciate your testimony today. And I just want to start off by saying that I believe every word that you said today, and I appreciate your honor, and I appreciate your honesty, and I appreciate your integrity and grit in coming forward in the way you have. So I do have some questions, though, and I'd be grateful for your input and your point of view. First and foremost, I'd like to know, the Prime Minister has said that you will be able to discuss all relevant information, but do you believe that there is relevant information that you are unable to include in your 30-minute statement that would be helpful for the committee?
Well, thank you for the comments and the question. As I said in my letter to the committee yesterday, as I said in my remarks today, the extent of the order in council and the waiver of privilege and confidentiality extends to January the 14th, when I was sworn in as the Minister of Veterans Affairs. So it does not include any conversations that occurred thereafter. It does not include conversations that I may or may not have had with the Prime Minister, and it does not include the conversation that I had with my former cabinet colleagues after my resignation from cabinet.
Do you think those would be relevant to our considerations?
Well, I believe that having heard some of the deliberations and questions asked by the committee over the course of the meetings that you've had, some of the questions would be answered if that information was made available.
One of the important pieces of your testimony today were the number of names that you provided for us, giving us a different list of characters that have been involved in this situation since it began in September. I'm wondering if you'd be so kind to provide us with a full list of those names. I've jotted down a few of them, but I don't have the complete listing. Would that be something you'd be willing to do for us?
I believe the full list of names is contained within the remarks that I think are being distributed. But if I counted incorrectly, I will provide all of the names.
I appreciate it. Just on page 14, you mentioned that there were various officials that came forward at the time. If you have any recollection of who the various officials were, that would be helpful for us in terms of making sure we have a complete list of all the witnesses. On January 7, you pointed out to us that you were told that you were being removed as the Attorney General. As well, you posted a very lengthy Facebook post after your movement to the Minister of Veterans Affairs, but I would assume that you thought a lot about what you would include in a note like this during the time when you were actually Attorney General. And as such, I think and I believe that the statement that you made, even though it was on when you were Minister of Veterans Affairs, technically did come to light and was part of your thought process when you were Attorney General. I just wanted to ask you a couple of questions about your Facebook post. The first one, and I quote, it's where, and you mentioned it in your remarks, "It has always been my view that the Attorney General of Canada must be nonpartisan, more transparent, and in this respect, always willing to speak truth to power." Do you believe, for the record, that you were removed as the Attorney General because you spoke truth to power on the topic of the SNC ongoing prosecution?
Well, thank you for the question, and I am going to have to be very careful what I say.
I understand.
I believe that I am able to speak to my thought processes from January the 7th up to the time that I was sworn in as the Veterans Affairs Minister.
Yes.
I think it's apparent from my remarks that I was concerned that the reason why I was being shuffled out of the Minister of Justice and Attorney General possibly was because of a decision I would not take on SNC and the DPA. I raised those concerns with the Prime Minister and with Jerry Butts. And as I said in my remarks, those were denied. I cannot speak to anything that I thought about after that point.
I appreciate that. Second part of this letter, you say that the unique and independent aspects of the dual role of the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General of Canada are even more important. I know Canadians across the country expect such high standards to continue to be met, especially in the uncertain times in which we now live, and I expect this to continue. I'd like to know if you are concerned that it's possible that the independence of the Office of the Attorney General is being eroded now, given what you've told us in your testimony today, your understanding that the current Attorney General was to be briefed on the SNC-Lavalin deferment decision.
Well, thanks for the question, and I will not comment on the current Attorney General, but I will comment on when I was the Attorney General and the thoughts that I had when I was on vacation in Bali and when I received a call from the Prime Minister. While I was the Attorney General through these 4 months, leaving aside all of the very inappropriate political pressure, interference, I was confident in my role as the Attorney General, that I was the final decision maker on whether or not a directive would be introduced on the SNC matter. So I knew as long as I was the Attorney General, this would not occur. I had concerns that when I was removed as the Attorney General, that this potentially might not be the case. I decided that I would embrace this new role, a very important role, and I really want to say publicly that the role of Veterans Affairs is an incredibly important role, and I took it very seriously. But I had decided to take on the role requested of me by the Prime Minister, but I had concerns, and I knew that in my new role, still sitting around the cabinet table, if there had been a directive that was placed into the Gazette, I would have resigned immediately from cabinet.
Thank you very
Well
much. Ms. O'Connell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here today and for providing your notes. I think they're helpful. My set of questions, I want to kind of get a general sense of some timelines. I know you've laid it out here, but just in trying to keep up a little bit. Would you say, or is it fair to say that in and around, and if I have the wrong date, please correct me, September 17th, I think is when you first met with the Prime Minister on where it wasn't the purpose of the meeting wasn't at first for the SNC Lavalin, but it was brought up. And is it fair to say, was it at that point that you felt the questions of your role and on this matter that you were uncomfortable at that point? Or would you say you were uncomfortable from the initial feedback that you heard that your chief of staff had been contacted by Mr. Chin? So let's kind of start there.
So there's a couple of questions in
Yeah.
there. If I don't answer them, please let me.
Yeah, no problem.
So the reason for I requested the September 17th meeting, as I said, on a different on an important matter. As I said, the Prime Minister brought up SNC and the deferred prosecution agreement. And with the clerk present, we had conversations about SNC. Well, he brought up SNC about jobs and the potential of job loss. And I will say, entirely appropriate conversations for the Prime Minister to bring up. What I will say is that the conversations turned to be completely inappropriate when there was discussion about the Quebec election, about the fact that the Prime Minister was a member of Parliament in Quebec. It was at that point that I immediately became concerned, and because I was the Attorney General, sought to have a conversation with the Prime Minister about the law, about the role of the Attorney General and the necessary independence that the Attorney General must have in exercising their discretion, in this case around a prosecution. The political concerns that were raised prompted me to ask the question of the Prime Minister directly if he was politically interfering with my role as the Attorney General. So at that point, my senses were heightened. The Prime Minister assured me that that was not the case. But soon thereafter, I instructed my staff and myself as well to ensure that we had a very detailed chronology of all meetings and conversations about SNC and deferred prosecution agreements.
Thank you. So you wouldn't say that it was a red flag necessarily on the topic or the conversations with Mr. Chin on September 7th, because it was those conversations about businesses. It was once the conversation in your mind changed to any politics. Or were you equally concerned on September 7th?
On the earlier meetings prior to the meeting with the Prime Minister, Ben Chin had conversations with my chief of staff. And again, in terms of public policy, in terms of having discussions about impacts of decisions and loss of jobs, that was appropriate.
Okay.
But I will say in those calls, and I don't have my notes in front of me, but I have a pretty generous memory. Mr. Chin raised the Quebec election. And I will say it's okay to talk about job losses. It's okay to talk about it in initial conversations. But when those topics continue to be brought up after there's a clear awareness that a decision has been made, it becomes inappropriate.
Thank you for clarifying. And sorry, I just want to clarify on that point because you mentioned you have notes and a pretty good memory. But in the written submission or your verbal remarks, any conversations, at least from September 7th, 8th, I think 11th, at least involving Mr. Chin, were with your staff, not you directly. Did you leave out conversations that you also had, or was it just notes that you had from your conversations with somebody who had a conversation with Mr. Chin? I just want to clarify.
Yeah, sure. No, I'm happy to answer the question if you'd permit me just to speak about how ministers, at least my minister's office works. I have an incredibly close relationship, necessarily so, with my chief of staff. I also at that time had a very close relationship with my judicial affairs advisor, who throughout some of this period of time was acting as my chief of staff, given that we were out of the country. Whenever my chief of staff has a conversation, she takes notes on the conversation and immediately relays the conversation to me, particularly in cases where there's concern